Good evening and welcome to the White Collar Support Group's Tuesday night speaker series. Tonight, our speaker is PG Sittenfeld. It's going to be a tremendous night, so stay with us. This will be on YouTube and on our website, so we'll tell you more about that in a minute. This event is brought to you by the White Collar Support Group. We're the world's first support group devoted to those navigating the white-collar criminal justice system and their families. We meet every Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, and we've been doing that for over 10 years. So we're celebrating our 520th meeting this coming Monday night. And if you know anybody who is involved in white-collar justice system, needs help, please have them reach out to us. Our website is prisonist.org. That's prisonist like feminist, prisonist.org. And you get all kinds of information there. And we have all kinds of events and initiatives and all kinds of information there. So I'm not gonna belabor that, but please, if you know anybody who is in need, please refer them to us. On June 14th, Karen Kelly from Castellanos is going to be our speaker. She's the former head of the Department of Justice Tax Division, and she's now a tax lawyer at Castellanos. And she's going to talk to us about criminal tax and the juxtaposition between white collar prosecutions and tax issues. So that should be really interesting. On September 29th, we're going to have Adam Bentley Clausen as our speaker. Adam did 20 years in prison, and since he's come out, he's set the world on fire. Not only has he got married and has a little baby who we got to meet at dinner last month in New York City, but Adam is also on the U.S. Sentencing Commission advisory group. So he's representing our community there, and we're really happy to have him be doing that. And on October 10th, we'll have our annual conference. So that conference is coming together. There'll be a lot more information about that, but it will be on Saturday, October 10th from 9 a.m. to noon. And more information will be sent out to everybody, and we hope you'll join us for that. Last year, our keynote speakers were Joe Bankman, Sam Bankman-Fried's father, and Jeffrey Toobin. And we already have one of our keynotes lined up for this October, but I'm not releasing that information until the end of the week. So welcome, everybody. I want to introduce PG Sittenfeld. He has asked me to not give a lengthy formal introduction because I'm sure he has a lot to say, and I don't think he wants me stepping on his story. But so we'll turn it over to PG, and PG, take it away.
Jeff, you're so obedient. First of all, so I'm on your end totally good on sound. Okay, perfect. If at any point there are technical difficulties, I would give the internet where I am, where I live, like a B+, so not infallible. And I will give before diving into some remarks that constitute a complete story, I will lavish a little bit more praise on Jeff. I actually, I was like so many of us, I found the experience of becoming a defendant disorienting and bewildering. And at one point I reached out to a very prominent journalist, not fairly prominent, a very prominent journalist who I didn't know. And I said, there's an echo. My headphones did not work. Are other people, am I echoey for other people?
You're doing okay, PG, you're doing okay. It's fine.
All right. I want to be sensitive to people's technical difficulties. And this journalist, I reached out not to connect to Jeff. And I said, can you put me in touch with another person? And they're like, the single human being on planet Earth who you need to connect with is actually Jeff Grant. And I have subsequently learned that he is, a mensch and a saint and a friend and all of the things that you all already know. It's also been through this group. Well, I'm not a regular, obviously. Gotten to know some of you on LinkedIn. I've gotten coffee with Brad Rouse in St. Louis. So I appreciate the community that this group facilitates. So I'm going to tell a pretty complete story here. And then at the end, if you have questions about pardons, Supreme Court, nonfiction writing, I'm glad to dive into anything you want. So Jeff, good. And if at any point the echoiness is distracting to anyone else, let me know and I will go hunt down some headphones. And I guess last housekeeping item on my end, if you think you hear an 11-month-old crying in the background, that's not your imagination. There is an 11-month-old crying in the background, but hopefully maybe out of your earshot. So if you were to rewind my life several years, I never could have imagined that I'd have become a criminal defendant and experienced an intense and high-profile 3-week jury trial, and that for 4.5 months until the day of my dramatic and very unexpected release by a panel of 3 federal appeals judges, I was federal inmate 18085-509 at FCI Ashland in Ashland, Kentucky. I could have never have imagined that a year after that very surprising early release pending appeal, I would then receive a full and unconditional pardon and become the first person who, after having that occur, still was in a position to and chose to move forward petitioning the U.S. Supreme Court on the same case for which I was pardoned. Among many, many astounding facts about my case is that the Attorney General of the United States, so as you all, this is like the person running the entire Justice Department, the Attorney General of the United States under President George H.W. Bush, President George W. Bush, and President Donald Trump, the White House counsel under Barack Obama, and many others, all submitted briefs to the court saying, this isn't right. No crime was committed here. So why, among others, did these law and order Republican former U.S. attorneys general weigh in on behalf of someone who was a local elected official, had been a Democrat, and someone who they had otherwise never met or never heard of? So how did all of this happen? And frankly, how did things go so wrong? Let me take you back now to how this pretty surreal legal saga got started. After growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where I still live, attending Princeton University for college and Oxford, England for graduate school, and working for an education nonprofit, I entered elected office at a young age, where my twin priorities were always trying to boost economic development and job growth for our city, and also trying to look out for the city of Cincinnati's most marginalized members of the community. In 2018, a former Cincinnati city council member asked me to meet with 2 men whom he described as out-of-town investors looking for real estate projects in the city of Cincinnati. At that point, I was a city council member by then in my 3rd term, and this was the sort of meeting that I took all the time, always viewing it as a chance to encourage people to be part of the sort of the renaissance that was unfolding in the city. And so I took the meeting with the 2 out-of-town investors early on a Monday evening. We were together for less than an hour. It was mostly informal and introductory because they didn't actually have a specific project that they were proposing. There was 0 mention of campaign donations by them or by me. And before we parted ways, I said the same thing to them that I said to everybody I met with, whether they were rich or poor or Black or white, lived in the city of Cincinnati, or were visiting from out of town. If I can be helpful with anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Never, never in a million years could I have imagined that those 2 men were undercover FBI agents unfurling a dragnet across Ohio, looking for public corruption in the state and in its cities, both large and small. I'm able to share direct verbatim dialogue with you all because almost all of the key interactions were recorded by the FBI at the time and subsequently played in court. And also, of course, because as a direct participant in those interactions, I have my own corroborating recollection of all of the events that unfolded. Now, even before meeting with those undercover agents posing as real estate investors, I had supported the revitalization of an enormous blighted building in the heart of downtown Cincinnati, which actually sits directly across from the region's main tourism and convention center. And the site is referred to by its address, 435 Elm. In addition to 435 Elm being dangerous and an eyesore, it was also costing city taxpayers $400,000 a year in maintenance and upkeep. So I spent nearly a decade as an elected official at City Hall. I faced a number of tough calls, tough decisions. Supporting the redevelopment of 435 Elm was not one of them. It was a total no-brainer, slam dunk. About 8 months after that otherwise, frankly, quite forgettable first interaction with those undercover agents, our paths were intentionally set up to cross again. A friend of mine at that time named Chinedum Ndukwe, he was a former NFL player for the Cincinnati Bengals, who then when he retired from the league, gone into real estate development, had purchased the air rights to the 435 Elm property, and he wanted to lead its redevelopment. Ndukwe, who was a personal friend of mine, so actually I called him Chin, told me that he had two investors backing the 435 Elm project, whom he thought would also want to be backers of my upcoming mayoral campaign, in which I was widely regarded as the most likely candidate to win. What I did not know, what was not publicly known to anyone at that time, was that earlier that same year, so we're still in 2018 in our chronology, Chin had signed a proffer agreement with the feds outlining his illegal conduct, described in the proffer agreement as, quote, criminal activity related to structuring banking transactions, money laundering, and aggravated identity theft, end quote, of the proffer he signed. Right around that time, Chin agreed to become a cooperating witness of the FBI. For almost a decade before that, we had both been personal friends, and during that time, he'd also been an enthusiastic and proactive donor to almost all of my political campaigns. I never have imagined that in 2018, he began to wear a wire during all of our conversations. Or I'm going to jump forward for just a moment in the timeline. As the US Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals judge would subsequently write in the majority opinion from February of last year, quote, all of the major players, except for Sittenfeld, were working for or with the government. That is, these were paid actors working to incriminate Sittenfeld, end quote, from a US Sixth Circuit federal appeals judge. During one of my recorded conversations with Chin in the fall of 2018, he told me that his out-of-town investors on that 435 Elm development, whose fictitious names were Rob and Brian, of course, I believe those were their real names, but whose fictitious names were Rob and Brian, said that they wanted to make $10,000 in campaign donations to me. Depending on how political people are, that number may or may not mean that much, but for context, I should probably note that I had already raised $1 million by that point into my campaign account. But Chin added when he said that his two investors would want to donate $10,000 relative to the 435 Elm project, they'd want to know that, quote, it's going to be a yes vote without a doubt. Despite in no universe ever fathoming that I might be on a wire, I immediately said, quote, obviously nothing can be illegal. Nothing can be a quid pro quo. And I know that's not what you're saying either, end quote. I then immediately reminded him of my long-held policy views, quote, what I can say is that I'm always super pro-development and revitalization of especially our urban core. While Chin's comment sounded odd to me, he was both a real estate developer in good standing in the community and an old personal friend, and I tried to immediately give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, Chin proceeded to arrange a lunch with him, me, and Rob, and when it was initially being set up, I didn't even realize that Rob was one of the two men. I'd met briefly, very briefly for less than an hour the prior February, and I only put that together when the two of us saw each other in person. At that lunch, we talked more about the 435 Elm development, and I asked various questions to continue vetting the project. As lunch concluded, Chinedum Ndukwe said that he needed to take off, and Rob asked if I could continue the conversation at the apartment that he was renting across the street. Sadly, only in retrospect would I learn this is what a highly choreographed FBI sting operation looks like. A lunch gets set up by a cooperating witness who, unbeknownst to anyone else, became a cooperating witness under the hovering threat of facing his own prosecution. Because of an existing relationship with that cooperating witness, taking such a meeting feels natural and normal. The cooperating witness then departs early, and the undercover agent asks you to join him at the penthouse, which conveniently is right across the street. During our brief time together in the penthouse, when Rob talked about the 435 Elm project, I again expressed my support for the project and asked a few more questions about it. When Rob brought up political donations, I responded with instructions on how he could make a lawful donation. When he attempted to provide a campaign donation in cash right then, because you actually are allowed to donate cash to a candidate's campaign, but like everything, there are rules around it. I called a campaign compliance finance expert on my staff to ask about that and then declined to accept it. Much later, again, in oral arguments, one of the Sixth Circuit judges characterized my and Rob's brief interaction in the penthouse that day as us talking past one another like ships passing in the night. And something that right through the present moment with you all here tonight has always felt mind-boggling to me is that in nearly 2 years of them engaging me in a sprawling and expensive sting entirely dependent on establishing an unambiguous quid pro quo as the relevant statute requires. I know there are many smart lawyers on the call, including our host tonight. There was only ever one such quid pro quo articulated. It was proposed by Chin at the direction and scripting of the FBI, who were paying and controlling him as their cooperating witness. And my response was to immediately and clearly reject it. Now, because this case centers, my case centered entirely on campaign donations, and in no universe would I have ever tried to personally pocket money, and the government never once alleged such a thing, this case was all about my intent. The government had to prove my mens rea. So regarding that intent, after the undercovers posing as real estate investors made donations to my political action committee, I reported those donations in my next filing with the Federal Election Commission, and those contributions could have been looked up by any of you or anyone else at any time with just a few clicks of the mouse on your computer. While meeting with the undercover agents in public and highly visible spots all around town, I would spontaneously introduce them to various civic leaders that we ran into, and I offered to introduce them to many more, because after all, I viewed them as people who wanted to back a project that was indisputably good for our city. And this group in particular might appreciate this final sort of anecdote reflecting intent. Regarding the sort of the kicker regarding my mens rea is that 3 weeks after what the government would later claim was an allegedly corrupt agreement at that lunch and apartment interaction after the lunch, I hosted at our home a dinner party with 4 other couples as guests. One of the couples included the sitting U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Ohio. Now, during a phone conversation I subsequently had with the undercover agents, I extended them an impromptu invitation to come join us for that dinner, where I even mentioned that one of the guests would be the sitting U.S. attorney. So you might ask yourself when considering intent, what person who is trying to be corrupt invites their alleged co-conspirators to come have dinner in his home with the very person who would prosecute him? If phase 1 of that sting operation was the government clunkily trying to conflate lawful political donations with my support for the 435 Elm project and try and conflate those, it seems almost certain they didn't have confidence that all of their effort had yielded a very strong case, because they then set in motion an elaborate phase 2 of their sting. As a former top prosecutor in DOJ's public integrity unit told me, you would never take on the risk, the effort, and the expense of an intricate sting operation if you truly believed you already had a winnable case. In phase 2 of their sting in 2019, some of you are probably thinking, this is our tax dollars at work. In phase 2 of the sting in 2019, the government brought in more undercovers. They provided additional campaign donations to my PAC, none of which I ever actually requested. And the undercover suggested that we take trips together, which I declined. Phase 2 of the sting yielded no line of dialogue or interaction that came remotely close to an unambiguous quid pro quo. And yet, in November of 2020, 8 FBI agents came to arrest me in the driveway of my home. At the time, my amazing wife, Sarah, who's the one shushing the sweet 11-month-old, my amazing wife, Sarah, was in the midst of her medical residency in oncology at the Cleveland Clinic. So on that fateful morning, I actually drove from Cleveland in the northeast corner of Ohio down to Cincinnati in the southwest corner of Ohio in order to be arrested at my home. When I reached my driveway, the 8 agents all turned toward me, and one of the agents stepped forward and said, "Hi, PG," as he and another agent came to put me in handcuffs. They asked me to turn around, put me in the cuffs with my arms behind rather than in front of me. And I've never forgotten, as they latched a cuff over each wrist, them saying, "We don't think you're a threat or a danger, but we have to do this." As I would later be told by a variety of former prosecutors, an indictment, as again, this group knows all too well, an indictment is meant to be a highlight reel against the person being charged, attempting to overwhelm them from the onset into a guilty plea. And even though prosecutors had cherry-picked comments for me to try to make my words seem incriminating, that day of my arrest, as I sat in a U.S. Marshal holding cell in downtown Cincinnati, reading the indictment for the first time, learning what the charges against me were for the first time, despite the unbelievably shocking experience to me, my spirits actually improved dramatically. The biggest relief was reading in the indictment the conversation between Chin and me when he'd said, "It would need to be a yes vote without a doubt." And I'd immediately responded, "Nothing can be a quid pro quo." I remember sitting in the U.S. Marshal holding cell that day and thinking, why did they bring this case in the first place? What's the real reason? I was released on my own recognizance later that day, and more than a year and a half passed between the time that I was indicted and when, believing fiercely in my innocence, I chose to go to trial. And again, I know so many of you know this so well. It's unbelievably unnerving being a defendant. I'd be curious what sort of mental images come to mind for you all, but I always sort of in my head had this notion of being strapped to a conveyor belt that was headed towards a buzzsaw. You know, your life, especially your professional life, is in limbo. Your reputation is getting battered, and there's so little that you can actually say to fight back. And worst of all, your loved ones are terrified that they're going to lose you to a lengthy prison sentence. I had the opportunity to avoid trial by accepting a plea deal, which even held the possibility of no prison time at all. And it never really seriously occurred to me to accept the plea deal because I couldn't fathom saying that I had done something that I hadn't done. And I say this at law schools all across the country. I want to be clear about that. I realize that defendants do this in our country and in our system every single day, not necessarily because of guilt, but to mitigate the potential punishment and because fighting can be financially ruinous. And even though it shouldn't be, it is a privileged position to be able to fight for your innocence by going all the way to trial. So that's what I did in June and July of 2022. For nearly 3 weeks, I sat as the defendant in the Potter Stewart Federal Courthouse in downtown Cincinnati. And I'm not going to give you a play-by-play of the trial today, but I say to every law schools and law firms and everywhere I go, if anyone ever wants to geek out on the court transcripts, I absolutely encourage people to do it. My lawyers and I asked that every second of every taped conversation that the government has made be played for the jury. After all, the government had chosen to concoct this entire sting. Why not give jurors access to everything? That was our logic. The government fought us on this point. The judge sided with them. And in the end, the jurors were only allowed to hear the tiniest sliver of the recordings. The FBI's 3 main undercover agents and Ndukwe all testified, and I took the stand in my own defense for several hours of both direct and cross-examination. During closing arguments, the lead prosecutor strikingly told jurors, quote, "This case is not about whether or not it was a good project or a bad project. It's not about whether the defendant is popular or liked or has got good ideas as a public official or whether he should have supported the project anyway. It doesn't matter," end quote from the lead prosecutor. What he did make very clear was that the 6 charges against me were all deeply intertwined, with all of them being public corruption charges based exclusively on campaign donations and exclusively from within the context of their sting operation. July 8th, 2022 was a Friday, and it marked the 3rd day of jury deliberations. And I remember arriving in the courthouse with my family. Sarah and I walked into the courtroom together for what I hoped would be the last time. My lawyers were already seated at the defense table, and I sat down in between them. And I remember taking long, deep breaths to try and stay calm in one of those sort of totally surreal moments in your life. The courtroom deputy did the sort of, TV-esque all rise for the jury. And as the jurors passed by me, I mostly kept my gaze toward the ground, but the few expressions that I sort of quickly glimpsed conveyed very little to me in either direction. The judge then told the jury foreperson to hand the completed jury form to the courtroom deputy, and he began to read it. In a loud, clear voice, he read out the first charge. How do you find the defendant, Alexander Sittenfeld, aka PG Sittenfeld, asked to count one, guilty or not guilty? And then he said, not guilty. In that moment, they were two of the sweetest words I had ever heard in my entire life, delivering a combination of relief, vindication, a feeling of freedom, and at that point, releasing more than a year and a half of pent-up emotion. And I closed my eyes, and tears of joy immediately started to stream down my face. The deputy then read out the second charge, and then again, those two exhilarating, hard-won words, not guilty. After hearing the first two acquittals and understanding again how completely interwoven all 6 counts were, because they were all about my intent, I thought, dear God, it's going to happen, 6 not guilties in a row. The courtroom deputy then continued on reading out the third charge as to count 3, guilty or not guilty, and then guilty. The next 3 counts were guilty, not guilty, not guilty, meaning across the 6 charges, 4 acquittals and 2 convictions. By splitting the outcome across the 2018 counts, the exact same time period, covering the exact same conduct, the jury, and I want to be clear here, this is their right, the jury was saying what was literally not possible, that my intent was simultaneously corrupt and also not corrupt. The fact that the jury acquitted me on all 3 charges related to 2019 further underscored the confounding nature of the outcome, because part of prosecutors' core argument had been the deeper into the sting PG got, the more he had to have known that these undercovers posing as investors were corrupt. And yet through their verdict, jurors found that I did not believe that the undercovers had corrupt aims in their dealings with me well into and at the end of the sting. The deputy saying guilty for the first time felt like a glitch in the universe. And I know I'm just one little life on this planet. So more accurately, it felt like a glitch in my universe, not unlike when I first learned I was being indicted. The kind of event, as you all know too well, that is uprooting and disorienting. And you know in the moment, it's going to change the course of things forever after. And especially in that moment, you can't always see the silver lining, and you can't see the beauty, and you can't see the redeeming things. You just feel disoriented and sort of a little bit lost at sea. As soon as the judge adjourned the hearing after the verdict, I went straight to Sarah. I wrapped my arms around her. We exited the courtroom and ducked into a little adjacent side room that our team had used during the trial. And when Sarah and I were still in that side room, we decided that one of my 3 older sisters, Curtis, would go and get a car from the parking garage and pull up directly in front of the courthouse. I said to Sarah, why don't you and your mom walk out separately from me so that you don't have to be next to me when I'm getting hounded by reporters. Every reporter in town relentlessly covered the trial. Of course, I preferred to walk out holding my wife's hand, but I also wanted to try and protect and shield her, even if it was in a very small way. We will walk out together, she immediately said to me. And I want to say here, because people like Jeff are certainly on this list, just as Sarah literally took my hand in that moment, so many people throughout this journey, family, friends, lawyers whom I didn't previously know, and whose only motivation has been truth and justice, have done the figurative version of taking my hand, which has collectively really helped and given me a lot of strength to keep taking the next step in what you all know can be such a harrowing journey and harrowing process. And their sort of collective support, as well as my Catholic faith, have actually, in the midst of this storm, provided me with an ongoing feeling of calm and resilience and optimism, even in the midst of so much turbulence. Something extraordinary happened very soon after the trial. 3 of the most respected law firms in the country, Jeff might have said one of their names at the beginning of this call, 3 of the most respected law firms in the country each reached out offering to lead my appeal entirely pro bono, believing that the outcome had been a wrongful conviction, that it badly misconstrued the law, and that in a country that has a system based on a private campaign finance system, that it set a dangerous precedent that could be a wrecking ball for the functioning of our democracy. The law firm of Jones Day, I like to inject a little bit of levity. We have an 11-month-old, and I was like, I don't know, Jones Day could be a good boy's name. I feel a lot of gratitude to that firm. Jones Day took over the appeal because they believe that this case, and these are their words here, not mine, represents the single most extreme attempt to criminalize lawful conduct involving campaign donations in American history. In one of Jones Day's briefs to the court, they described the government's sting as a year-long prosecutorial Truman Show, a reference to a movie I suspect many of you have seen. And Jones Day summed up the stakes by saying, quote, "If this evidence suffices, prosecutors would be free to conjure a bribery charge against every politician, ushering in a First Amendment ice age." In the lead up to my sentencing hearing, the court probation officer assigned to research and draft the pre-sentence investigation report wrote, quote, "There are no identifiable victims associated with this case." And while I agreed wholeheartedly with the sentiment, when you have been prosecuted and convicted of a crime, it's also a very jarring and disorienting thing to hear. On the day of my sentencing in October of 2023, the judge handed down a 16-month term of incarceration. Now, 2 months after my sentencing and just 2 weeks before needing to report to the satellite camp at FCI Ashland, that basically unprecedented bipartisan set of amicus briefs, especially for the circuit court level that I mentioned at the beginning, were filed saying that such a case either should have never been brought or that the conviction should now be overturned. And though I mentioned their positions, I'll call some of them out by name. Those who decided to join the briefs included former United States Attorney General John Ashcroft, former United States Attorney General Michael Mukasey, former United States Attorney General Bill Barr. Think about this. Amazingly, the very man who led DOJ at the time of my indictment signed on to a brief saying this is all wrong, as well as I mentioned earlier, White House counsels, former federal public corruption prosecutors, and dozens of other high-profile individuals and legal experts. And while these major figures from the sort of prior 4 decades at the Department of Justice and the American legal arena saying that, you know, this had been a badly sort of misconstrued outcome did not change my imminent incarceration, it did at least personally feel meaningful to me and like a sign that the truth has its ways of getting out. I know that doesn't always happen in plenty of instances, but you look for those glimmers of sunlight even when the direction is not the one you want. This brings us very briefly to my imprisonment. And for our time together tonight, I'm glad to come back to any of this, but I'll simply say that at a personal level, I found prison to simultaneously be awful in all the ways that you would expect, weirdly fascinating, and to everyone who was open to it, it could really be a place of rich community and camaraderie. And writing is actually the main thing I'm doing now. I had a piece in the New York Times, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 months ago that I tried to do justice to that sort of really rich sense of community that I experienced there. The hardest part for me, as I know is the case for probably almost everyone here, by far, was being away from my wife and from our young sons. The best part, maybe I should put best in air quotes, was that I quickly became the most prolific maker of cheesecake on the prison compound. Some of you might have been cheesecake makers too. I will immodestly say that my concoction, my recipe was universally regarded as delicious. We can swap recipes later on. I'd been incarcerated for a little over 4 months by the time oral arguments occurred for my appeal before the Sixth Circuit. I was not allowed to attend oral arguments and was instead 100 miles away behind razor wire fences wearing my prison greens. Fast forward 6 days later, it was a Wednesday, which began for me like any other day in prison, at a relatively light morning of work for my prison job, which included helping distribute supplies around the compound and getting new arrivals settled in. Late that morning, an inmate came by my cubicle, studied my face for a second and said, "You don't know, do you?" I was sitting in my bed, writing, talking to my cell. I was like, "Know what?" I asked. "I just talked to my wife on the phone and she said it is all over the news that the Sixth Circuit is sending you home today," he said. I sprang up, hugged the guy who had delivered the news, though I honestly still didn't believe it. And I took off running in the direction of the prison phone room. I called my wife, Sarah. She picked up and through tears, she said, "Have you heard?" And most of the rest of that particular conversation was just both of us crying, though I do recall her saying, "I'm getting in the car to come get you." As is the case with all items of interest in prison, and if we're being honest, a lot of items that are of no interest at all, word spread like wildfire. So guys were coming up to me to say congratulations. A number of guys reached out for a handshake and were very awkward when I enveloped them in a hug, because we all know hugs not so common in prison. And I kid you not, at least 10 guys were like, dude, who's going to make all the cheesecake now without you here? I'd really become a cheesecake factory. About 5 hours after first hearing that totally stunning news, I walked through the back door of my house that evening, embraced my young sons, and the moment sort of turned to chants of daddy, 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 and a family hug that even our dog Oakley, true story, came and put her paws in the hug for. But unfortunately, this saga did not quite end there. The same panel that chose to take the unbelievably rare step of releasing me early pending appeal upheld the case against me in a 2-1 split decision in February of last year that was extraordinarily unusual in that all 3 judges in 3 separate opinions said Supreme Court review was warranted and needed. And so the team at Jones Day and I, we were stunned, but we said full speed ahead with our petition for writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court. On May 28th of last year, so this is like almost a year ago to the day, the Jones Day team and I were just days away from submitting our by then completed cert petition, which was a superb piece of legal advocacy. Most of the folks on the team that, again, were doing this out of a sense of righteous indignation and for the cause, totally pro bono. Almost all of them had been Supreme Court clerks themselves. So it was the cert petition was a brilliant piece of legal advocacy. I was working at home that day and also getting organized to take my then 5-year-old son on a camping trip the following morning. And a little after 4 p.m., while sitting at my home office desk, I learned in one of the most surreal moments of my life that I had received a full and unconditional pardon from President Trump. And over the phone, one of the Jones Day lawyers read aloud to me the brief formal verbiage of the pardon. The president had signed it just a few hours earlier, and at 4:16 p.m. that afternoon, I was looking, still feeling pretty dazed, at a signed digital copy in my inbox. I cannot emphasize enough, a pardon was in no way on my radar, not because I wouldn't have welcomed one, but because I hadn't applied for or pursued one. And I hadn't applied for one because, maybe naively, I hope not, I still believe that the judicial process might deliver justice, even if it took going all the way to the United States Supreme Court to get it. Now, Sarah was at that time 8 months pregnant with our 3rd son. She arrived home not long after we'd received the stunning news. I walked from my home office over to find her in our bedroom, told her what had just happened. We embraced, shared what a relief it was, especially on the brink of welcoming another baby, and then also agreed what a very weird thing to experience in one's life. And it was news that basically fit the pattern that at basically every juncture of this years-long legal saga, the wildest and most dramatic thing that could happen is what did happen. Now, after that latest shocking turn of events, it turned out, and I can come back to this if anyone wants to sort of be a legal geek about it, that our appeal actually was not mooted. So as I mentioned, I became the first person in US legal history who had ever received a presidential pardon and was still in a position to and chose to move forward petitioning the US Supreme Court as part of the same case. I felt the stakes went well beyond me, and I'm sure there's some folks here who are quite political, others who aren't political at all, and maybe some in between. But I felt like the consequences touched every candidate and donor engaged in lawful, constitutionally protected political conduct. That if the misguided charging theory of this prosecution, that a lawful campaign donation between donor and candidate who share the same policy objectives, if that can be construed as bribery and is allowed to persist, how many qualified people will be too afraid to ever run for office? And how many citizens who want to support their candidate of choice with a donation will refrain from participating altogether? Some of you might know this. I definitely did not. When the justices of the US Supreme Court convene for their conferences to consider cases, it's just the 9 of them in a room together. No aides, no law clerks, no one else. I assume they all sort of had their entourage with them. Not the case. They took up our petition at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 consecutive conferences And less than 2 months ago, they unanimously vacated my two remaining convictions. In any given year, and I'm sure this group knows this, in any given year, you can usually count on two hands and sometimes on just one hand the number of cases where the US Supreme Court vacates a criminal conviction. So this was a long road, as you've heard, but it was also a wonderful and very hard-fought victory. With all that being said, appreciate the chance to be with you all tonight and share that pretty wild backstory. But I'm also want to save enough time to answer your questions, talk about what I'm doing now, listen to stories, feedback, anything from you all. So I will actually pass it back to Jeff and welcome any dialogue.
PG, that was unbelievable. Thank you so much for that story and for trusting us with it. And I can probably speak on everyone's behalf, but certainly on my own, that there are parts of that story that ripped open old wounds of mine that, both in sadness and in joy. I mean, it's the serpentine path that we've all been on. And
Yeah.
but for you to actually be able to share it with such eloquence is just so wonderful. Anyway, we're going to open it up to questions. I'm not going to ask the first question tonight. I'm going to open up to questions. Anyone like to ask a question? Please put your name in chat and I will call on you. Let's start with Lucky.
And Jeff, I'll also say I'm, some of you I recognize names from LinkedIn. If someone doesn't want to ask something tonight but wants to connect later, certainly feel free to reach out that way.
That's great. Let's start with Lucky, and we could use more names in chat, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, PG. Beautiful story. I've experienced a little bit of the same with a very misguided prosecution and could end up in the Supreme Court. I was acquitted, and then the government appealed that. But yeah, I'm anxious to hear more about that process and learn more. I'll connect with you on LinkedIn. Anyway, just thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that. What a ride.
Yeah, thank you. And I do, everyone is, this is less to this group and more sort of like to people I meet as I meander across the country. I kind of tell people, they come up, I'm not a big fan of people's puppy dog eyes, even when offered totally sincerely. And the only reason I say that is everyone's on a life journey, right? And to me, I try not to have my so do I think a total miscarriage of justice unfolded in a tragically flawed system that we all know a lot about? I do, but I actually, for me, sort of the measure of a life is do you get to pump out a lot of love? Do you get to receive a lot of love back? So I do want folks to know, and Jeff, point well taken. I mean, I hope some of the moment when the FBI shows up at your doorstep and things, I hope certain elements weren't too triggering, but I also want folks to know, I both think what unfolded was deeply unjust, but it opens your heart, right, in a good way, and new friends and a level of compassion. So anyway, I just wanted to add that.
Well, I don't think
Lucky, thanks for your comment.
I don't think you have to worry about that, PG. We talk about it on this.
Sure, of course.
Let's see. We're going to go to Elizabeth and then Linda.
Thank you. What a story. And after hearing it, I felt very, very proud of to have the building that I do have on the back of my screen as background. That being said, your investigation and prosecution came on the heels of the prosecution of Jimmy DeMora and other politicians in Cuyahoga County. And I wanted to know what impact, if any, you think that the public's outrage for those crimes, which indeed were crimes, might have had on your case?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess at a very technical level, that was Northern District.
Sure.
It is probably worth mentioning one of the people at Jones Day who became part of the pro bono team that was we need to fight this injustice, had been served as the U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. And he was this is my prosecution is one of the most shameful prosecutions I've seen in my entire career.
Yeah.
To address the more global thing you said, Look, you don't have to tell me as a former politician and as a current citizen, right? Like why people feel cynical about politics. It looks like a food fight. It looks like people who are self-interested, not fighting for people. And I think, unfortunately, that sort of like brush can get painted even for people. Like I felt like I was in it for pretty darn sunny, idealistic reasons. So many of you have probably experienced, we pay a lot of lip service and pay homage to the notion of the presumption of innocence. There are all sorts of scenarios where people walk into a courtroom and the reality is a presumption of guilt, not a presumption of innocence. When you are a politician on trial and it sort of revolves around money and politics, like people don't like money in politics and people don't like politicians. That was never lost on me. Now, what a sort of egregious thing when people's generalized dislike of that, which could send an innocent person to prison, separate from their family. So yeah, I think that's absolutely in the backdrop. And I'll be honest with you, I mean, there was, as I mentioned, there was an amicus brief entirely signed by former federal public corruption prosecutors. You don't see a whole lot of briefs where prosecutors are criticizing
No.
their own. That being said, I think there was at many turns there was bad faith in this prosecution, and I wouldn't doubt that the people who advanced this thought, like we might not be right on the law, but we can probably, that doesn't mean you can't get a conviction. I mean, this is part of the overall problem with our justice system. Justice and winning are not the same thing, but way far too often they get conflated. But yes, I have gratitude to the process that unfolded. This process has given me more overall appreciation for the judiciary, for its role, for the layers of appeal. I mean, you have to have a lot of patience to be patience, forms of privilege, whatnot, to be willing to run the entire gauntlet. But as everyone on this call knows, the by far the most common way the Supreme Court resolves a situation is by denying, right? And they don't also have to offer any explanation. So for them to do what they did 2 months ago, I have a deep, deep gratitude.
Was Hank Ashbill still at Jones Day? And did he
No,
work on your brief?
no, actually, during the very early days, I know I had a conversation with Hank. He has a lot of expertise in
Oh, to say the least, yeah.
wins in this area of the law, but actually he partnered on Governor McDonald's case.
Sure, that's why I asked.
Yeah, so my counsel of record, including at this very moment, is Noel Francisco.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, so Hank was not one of my lawyers, but we've spoken and I think very highly of him.
Great.
All right, I know I want to make sure we have plenty of time.
Yeah, sure.
Elizabeth, thanks for your question.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Before we get to Linda's question, how would you like people to contact you, PG? Would you like it through LinkedIn, or do you want to give a email address? What would you?
Yeah, or I can put my email on here too.
All right, that's great. All right, so everyone.
If and I'll say I can blame having 3 very young Tasmanian devil wonderful children. If I don't respond promptly to your first email, there's no malice. Send me one follow-up and I will get it by the follow-up.
There you go. All right, we're going to Linda, and then we're going to go to Anthony, and then we'll go to Greg.
But I put that in there.
Okay.
You're up, Linda.
Great story. So happy for the outcome. I do have a question. At your sentencing, what was the prosecution asking for as far as time, and what was your restitution amount?
So good questions. The prosecution, really, they were asking for I'm sure it had just kicked in, that 2-point deduction. I can't, maybe something related to the First Step Act. They were basically asking for 4 to 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
I was given 16 months. And there was zero restitution. I mean, the court itself, right? The probation officer was like, this is a victimless crime. I voluntarily gave funds back to the government of their phony donations that they had gone to great lengths to make totally real and lawful. And then a pretty arbitrary fine was assessed of $40,000. That's all public. but it wasn't restitution. It was
Right,
just,
it was, they had to get something out of you.
yeah. Well, it's interestingly, since you brought it up, the assessment of that $40,000 fine was by far, it made it very clear that even on the other side of receiving a full and unconditional presidential pardon, we weren't mooted. Jeff, I'll play a lawyer on television here for a second. There's an 1877 Supreme Court case called Note, Knote, and it says that a pardon does not touch property already in the possession of the government.
Yeah.
So the fine that was, again, sort of arbitrarily assessed was already in the Treasury. So it was a clear case of non-mootedness. So in a weird way, and it kept my ability to go all the way to the Supreme Court to get justice in that form alive.
So
Were you able to get your money back then?
Well, so the Supreme Court ruled 2 months ago. We are waiting. I mean, I think it should be fairly procedural, but waiting on it to go back down. I think, assuming
they take it a lot faster than they give it back.
that sounds right. Yes, but that's among our expectations.
thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
Let's go to Anthony and then Greg.
Hi, thank you all thank you for sharing your story, as well as all the folk that put this whole program together. I appreciate it. I would like to ask you, Mr. PG, having gone through trial, what changes do you think it can make in this whole jury void hour thing? When you go to trial, everyone who's never been to trial has this idea that you pick your jury. And that's so crazy, because I went to trial twice on my case in Houston, Texas, and it was amazing. I had 14 people, 13 white folk and 1 black folk on both trials. And it's so structured where they eliminate, you kind of can carve out what you want to have in the jury if you're in the prosecution, because the people that you choose from are set so far back, and you can't just say, oh, I'll take 27 in the back and what have you. What do you think could be done to change these juries, even when you go to trial? Because I feel like they're kind of slanted,
Yeah, great question. You may or may not find this to be an answer, because I've thought a lot about a lot of different aspects of this. Voir dire is actually, I'm sure that's right for many forms of reform too. So let me just maybe kind of take this in order of how I think about it. As we all know, once they ring the bell with an indictment, there's so much institutional inertia. Like, even when justice would be fast relief, that's just not how the system is designed. So of course, like, I'm interested in systemic reforms that funnel people less people into this sort of like, conviction machine in the first place. Once you are in it, and this won't be a direct answer to your question, but it'll sort of be like why everybody's brain is needed to sort of put the two things that I thought were, as a non-lawyer, as a first-time defendant, as someone who was shocked to become a defendant, that were really striking to me, and these may or may not resonate. One, in the jury instructions, the judge saying, you all must come to a unanimous agreement. It was really striking to me that that's allowed to be said with all the authority from the bench, because it's just very literally not true. It is a preference of the court, but to send jurors back to the jury room thinking, okay, we have to agree, like, that's just not the rule. That's not the law. It is the strong preference of the system. So it's like, what a weird thing to say, what is preference. No, but it really, I think, frames how people think about it. Now, the other thing, and I understand why it is a jury's decision to be the trier of fact, and then a judge is the person who handles punishment. However, I always thought trying to totally divorce, the verdict decision from the punishment, as though those things have nothing to do with each other. And I think there must be situations where a jury might think, we mostly think this person is innocent, but we're uncomfortable with this or that. And they might think, oh, this person will get a slap on the wrist, or they'll pay a fine. They're not picturing a mom or a dad or a grandmother hugging their children goodbye to go off for a lengthy sentence. So I don't know. I mean, you could think through how you would do it, but so Anthony, to your good question, I'm sure there are things in the voir dire.
May I ask one more?
I
And one more
defer to
thing.
Jeff post.
Okay.
Right. Go ahead, Anthony. Make it quick, please.
Okay, Will. On as far as when I was fighting my case and I looked at the records, it's amazing how you're never allowed to have recordings, because when the stenographer's typing up the court records, when the judge yells out, or say if the judge is angry about something, it's not typed in and the judge yells this at that. You don't get the whole courtroom demeanor, when you're just reading paper. So I think with all the technology, it really should be recorded. So if you're ever going to appeal your case or fight your case, you should have some kind of recording to go with the transcript so you can catch the overall whole picture.
I mean, so many people who have been part of law enforcement, cops, prosecutors, were so disgusted with this prosecution. And I talked to a lot of them, but I remember one of them saying he'd been a former federal prosecutor, and he was like, PG, it's always a home game for the federal government. And I thought that was a good sort of articulation of that. And I mean, again, to your point, look, I've got a pretty good education under my belt. I was a lawmaker at the city level. The whole notion that the government can choose to try, I believe unsuccessfully, but try and stage a crime, make all these recordings, and then you can say, hey, play all of their tapes at trial, and they can't do that. I mean, it's always a home game for the government. What a strange set of rules that's even allowed to be the process. So.
Exactly. Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Anthony. Next is Greg, and then Terry.
Yeah, PG, that was a riveting story, and you're a wonderful storyteller. I'm not sure what's better.
Zoom doesn't do it justice, but that's kind of you.
I'm not sure what's better, the story or you're the way you tell it. So, just to clarify, you said you didn't know a pardon was coming. Is that right?
100% accurate.
Do you know now kind of what was going on sort of behind the scenes, that all the actions that led up to securing that pardon? Or is it still a mystery to you?
There's definitely, I'm able to sort of like use my intuition to try and sort of put some pieces together. So to be clear, like the element of mystery is I was not a fly on the wall in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
But I will say this. We were days away from submitting our cert petition, right? Who has to defend the other side? The Solicitor General's Office of the United States. I think it's probably possible that they were like, we didn't bring this garbage. Why do we need to be the ones that go and have to, risk getting sort of mowed down in oral arguments in front of the Justice Supreme Court? And my sense is at some point, the Justice Department being the handlers of it, it got from the Justice Department on the radar of the White House counsel's office. And I think they, on the merits, I'm sure the political views of people on this call run the gamut too, although we're probably unified in a lot of outrage around flaws in our criminal justice system. I think on the merits, when it was put on their radar, they were disturbed by what had unfolded. So I think it didn't seem to me like accidental. They kind of on the brink of getting ready to force the government to defend it, that form of relief. Now, obviously, we chose to go forward submitting the petition anyway.
So you don't think there was months and months and months of activity going on? You think that the length of time that took place between action started on the pardon and you received it were like days or weeks?
I don't know, because I don't know the exact mechanism by which it got on the radar of whoever in the White House who said, Mr. President. I also, when you have a really, really, really strong Supreme Court case, that might mean you have a 50-50 chance of being granted certiorari. And then, based on the nature of the case and the composition of the court, you can try and guess how likely you are to prevail there. But based on having some of the smartest lawyers on the planet who, as I've said, like they were doing this out of a sense of righteousness, they thought we had an incredibly good shot of getting to and prevailing in the US Supreme Court. So that's where that's where everybody's focus was, right? And they put in a lot of work to get that. So it just wasn't, like, would I have, one, I probably just didn't think I was a Democratic office holder. Like I'm not the profile of who maybe people think of receiving pardons, if I can say that sort of in that form. So it didn't seem possible to me. Like, would I have maybe tried like to throw a Hail Mary before being separated from my family again? Hell yes, I would have done anything. But our focus was 100% on prevailing in the Supreme Court. So no one on earth was more shocked than I was the day that news came.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. We're running out of time, folks. Let's go to Terry. And I apologize to anyone else who's on the list, but you can reach out to PG yourselves. Let's go to Terry, and then I'm going to ask one last question. All right, Terry, go ahead.
Okay. Thanks for your story. It was great. One of the things we all talk about is the trust in people. And it sounded like in your case, it was a very big blind side by somebody that you trusted, was a good friend for years, and became a witness and everything like that. So kind of 2 points are 2 questions. One, have you ever had that conversation with that person ever on like what happened there? And number 2, how has that changed going forward for you with the trust in people when that happened? Such a huge thing happened out of this that you had no idea was coming, no idea,
Yeah, it's a great question. I have a lot of kind of unearned, like God-given sunniness and optimism, and my gratitude muscles are like pretty well exercised and whatnot. So the logic of your question, I mean, it's spot on, right? I've always known, I ran into a perfect storm of a terrible miscarriage of justice. We think they spent between $2 and $5 million to try and create a non-existent crime, to separate someone that was like in public service for good reason from his family. And I've always thought, just as I'm like trying to be a believer in like, don't let other people steal your joy, I don't want them to take away my trust in other people and my optimism. I mean, so I think there's probably a balancing act around like, what's kind of the right word of sort of like, that sounded a little odd. Let me sit with it for a second, rather than being like, oh, I give everyone the benefit of the doubt. But I don't want this crazy situation to diminish my, love of my fellow man and woman. So I've kind of tried to make a point that like, that they didn't win, right? That would be them winning, is kind of how I look at it. So I get your point. No, that individual, no. And then to me, it's like he can answer to God in the fullness of time. And by the way, I'm almost like in my Catholicism, I was innocent of this. Like, I am a very flawed human being, right? So I mean, forgiveness, I think, is like, it's virtuous to practice, but also if we want forgiveness, we need to be willing to give it to other people. Sometimes it's really hard, right? I've tried to let my answer to your question be actually no, but I do understand it.
I apologize to anyone else who has questions, because we are out of time. I am going to ask one last question though. And then anybody who'd like to communicate with PG, it's at pg.sittenfeld@gmail.com, or you can reach out to him on his LinkedIn.
Yeah, they are LinkedIn either.
Yeah, on his LinkedIn page. So PG, what's your jumping off point now here? I mean, what are your plans for the future, the rest of your life? You're going to go to law school? You're going to run for president of the United States? I mean, what's your plan?
Yeah, I've really been having a ball, and it's felt purposeful, telling stories that try to sort of like excavate and draw out the humanity in an inhumane system. So I'll forecast 2 of them that are coming up soon. I think it's and I'll share this on my LinkedIn. Some of you might know the second in command at the Federal Bureau of Prisons is the first person in the history of the BOP to have previously been in its custody. He spent 5 years as a prisoner, and he's now the second in command. And I'm hopeful for someone who brings that lived experience and has that perspective. He would, if he was here, I think he'd describe himself as a like tough on crime and all that stuff. But I think there's a lot of compassion there. So I have a long profile of him coming out shortly. I have another long feature that's about guaranteed income for parents returning from incarceration. So for a period of like 6 months to 18 months, you receive $500 to $1,000 a month, no strings attached. And people are always like, well, what are they going to spend it on? Rent, food, diapers, their children. So I mean, Jeff, I think when I was in elected politics, you're very sort of like, this happens and then this happens and then this happens. I'm sort of like, here to let the universe guide me a little bit more. But in the nearest future, I want to spend like, several years telling stories that can hope maybe kind of stir people, get them thinking a little bit. And, if that leads to my doing something different, I'm bringing open-mindedness, but I really like writing. It seems like storytelling that evokes compassion from people. Seems like the world maybe needs a little bit more of that right now. But I don't know, Jeff, if you have good ideas, send them to me, because I was supposed to be the mayor of like a significant American city at age 36 or 37. And instead I'm sort of 41 years old. I'm like, what do I want to do when I grow up? But I'm trying to see that as a form of liberation and enjoy it. And I will also say the most fun, most joyful thing I've done in the last 3 months, without question, was being the kindergarten boys track coach for my oldest son. So this is also, I mean, again, like I try and look for the silver lining, look for the blessings. This is a good season of life based on the age of my family and my children to not be running around in the way that politicians have to. So yeah. And by the way, on that point, if people have a good story, I mean, I usually look for a story. I'll look for the intersection of a really compelling human story that has like a beginning, a middle, an end, a twist, a turn, that intersects with, a beefy societal question. So if you have thoughts, you can always reach out with those too.
PG Sittenfeld, thank you so much for being
Great to be with everyone tonight.
It was a wonderful, wonderful evening. For those of you out there, please check us out on our website, prisonist.org. That's prisonistlikefeminist.org. We meet every Monday night, and if you know anybody who's in need, please refer them to us. And thank you, PG, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. And this will be on YouTube and on our website shortly. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.